Name the American commander who invented modern close air support. Not the man who dropped the atomic bombs, not the man who burned Tokyo to the ground in a single night, not the bomber barons whose faces you already know from every documentary ever made. Name the one who figured out how to put a fighter pilot directly over the heads of advancing tanks, the one who worked out how to talk that pilot onto a German gun by radio in the space of a few minutes, while the shooting was still going on, the one who turned the airplane into a piece of artillery that flew. You can't, can you? Almost nobody can, and that is not an accident. Ask 100 people who love this history to name the great American air commanders of the Second World War, and you will hear the same names over and over. Hap Arnold, Carl Spaatz, Jimmy Doolittle, Curtis LeMay, Ira Eaker, every one of them a strategic bombing man. Every one of them tied, in one way or another, to the idea that you win a war by flying over the enemy's army entirely and smashing his factories from 4 miles up. And then the list runs dry. The man who did the opposite, the man who stayed low, who flew with the mud and the tanks and the infantry, who arguably did more to win the ground war in Europe than any airman alive, is missing from the list. His name was Elwood Quesada. Everyone who knew him called him Pete. And by the time he was finished, the First Army of the United States trusted its air cover to him the way a rifleman trusts the man on his flank. Omar Bradley, who commanded that army, wrote later that this man Quesada was a jewel. Those were his exact words. A jewel. So here's the question. This whole story turns on, if he was that good, if the general who commanded American ground armies said so in plain language, then why has the country he served forgotten his name almost completely? Why is there no movie? Why is there no monument that anyone visits? Why, when the modern Air Force fights its endless internal war over whether close air support even matters, does almost no one invoke the man who invented the American version of it? The answer is the whole reason this channel exists. Because the people who write the history are usually the people who won the argument. And Pete Quesada lost the argument. Not on the battlefield. He never lost there. He lost it afterward, in Washington, in the meeting rooms and the budget fights, to men who had a grander and cleaner and far more marketable idea of what air power was supposed to be. They buried his methods, they gutted his command, and then they let his name slide quietly off the page. This is the story of the air commander the Air Force chose to forget. Let me show you the gap first, because until you see the gap, you won't understand how strange it is. Open almost any popular history of the American Air War in Europe, and here is the shape of the story you get. Brave young men climb into heavy bombers. They fly deep into Germany without enough fighter escort. They die in numbers that are hard to even say out loud. And then, in the nick of time, the long-range escort fighter arrives, the P-51 Mustang, and the tide turns, and the bombers get through, and the war is won from the air. It is a true story. We have told large pieces of it on this channel because it deserves telling. But notice what is missing. That entire story happens at 20,000 feet and above. It is a story about airplanes fighting other airplanes and airplanes hitting factories. The soldier on the ground, the man with the rifle and the tank and the terror of the German 88 barely appears. And yet the war in Europe was won on the ground. It was won by armies that had to cross France and cross the Rhine and take Germany field by field and town by town. And every one of those soldiers, every single one, needed something that the strategic bombing story does not even mention. They needed air power that came down out of the sky and killed the thing that was killing them right now in the next hedgerow before it could fire again. That is close air support. And the American way of doing it, the good way, the way that actually worked, was largely built by one man and the team he assembled around a simple, radical idea, that the airplane belonged to the soldier as much as to the airman. The mainstream story skips him because the mainstream story was written by the winners of a doctrinal argument that Quesada was on the wrong side of. And to understand why, you have to understand who he actually was, because he was not what you would expect. He was born in Washington, D.C. in the spring of 1904 to a Spanish father and an Irish-American mother. That mattered, in a service that in those years was overwhelmingly Protestant and old stock American. He was a Catholic with a Spanish surname in an officer corps that noticed such things. He went to the University of Maryland on a football scholarship, and then to Georgetown, and he was, by every account, restless, hot-tempered, physical, and completely uninterested in the polite career path. He enlisted as a flying cadet in the autumn of 1924, and he found the thing he was born to do. He could fly. More than that, He had a feel for machines, and for what machines might become. An engineer's mind riding around inside a fighter pilot's body. That combination is rarer than you would think, and it is the key to everything he did later. Now here is the piece of his early career that ought to make his later erasure impossible, and somehow didn't. In the first week of January 1929, a small Army airplane took off from a field near Los Angeles and refused to come down. It was a Fokker trimotor, and it had a question mark painted on its side, and its entire purpose was to prove that an airplane could stay in the air more or less indefinitely if you could refuel it in flight. This was close to science fiction at the time. The airplane stayed up for 150 hours, more than 6 full days. It hooked up with tanker aircraft 43 times, 12 of those link-ups in the dark, when a mistake met a fireball. It flew something like 11,000 miles without ever landing. And when it finally came down, all 5 men aboard received the Distinguished Flying Cross. One of those 5 men, one of the pilots wrestling that airplane through 6 days and nights over Southern California, was a young lieutenant named Pete Quesada. The others included Carl Spatz and Ira Eaker, men who would go on to run the strategic bombing campaign that history remembers. Quesada was in that cockpit with them, at the very birth of the modern Air Force, and history has misplaced him anyway. Think about what that tells you about how thoroughly a man can be forgotten when the institution decides it has no use for what he came to stand for. Through the 1930s, he did the things that ambitious, capable officers did. He served as an assistant military attaché in Cuba. He advised the Air Force of Argentina. He worked in intelligence in the office of the Chief of the Air Corps, close to the men at the top. He made Major early in 1941, Lieutenant Colonel a year later, and Brigadier General in December of 1942, which is a startlingly fast climb. He took a fighter command to North Africa in early 1943, and there, in the skies over Tunisia and Sicily and Italy, he did something most generals never do. He flew combat missions himself, 21 operational missions in North Africa, in an era when the brass were supposed to command from the ground. He wanted to know what he was asking his pilots to do. Over his life, he would survive 8 airplane crashes. This was not a desk man. And in North Africa, he learned the 2 lessons that would define him. The first was radar. He got his hands on the new ground-based radar and signals equipment, and he understood, faster than almost anyone, that radar was not just a defensive tool for spotting incoming raids. It was a way to see the whole sky, to know where your own airplanes were, and therefore to direct them, to move them around the battlefield like pieces on a board. The second lesson was cooperation. He learned to work directly with ground commanders, to sit with the Army and solve the Army's problems, instead of treating the air war as a separate and superior campaign that happened to share a map. Hold on to those 2 lessons, radar and cooperation, because when he got to England to prepare for the invasion of France, he was about to combine them into something no Air Force on Earth had ever quite done before. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. And I'll be honest with you, a lot of you in the comments have been asking for this one, and some of you have personal connections to this story, fathers and grandfathers who flew the Thunderbolt or worked the ground crews of the 9th Air Force. I want to do it justice. Now, back to Pete Quesada and the machine he built over Normandy. In the build-up to the invasion, Quesada was given command of a new outfit. It was called the 9th Tactical Air Command, and its entire reason for existing was to support the First Army of the United States as it fought its way inland from the beaches. This was not glamorous work by the standards of the Air Corps. The glamour was all with the 8th Air Force and its bombers pounding Germany. The tactical mission, flying low, hitting tanks and trucks and bridges, holding hands with the infantry, was seen inside the Air Corps as a lesser calling. Quesada did not care. He had found his war. His command was the larger of the 2 American tactical air commands in France, and it could put something like 11 fighter groups into the air. The 9th Air Force as a whole, by the late spring of 1944, fielded 18 fighter groups and something close to 1,500 aircraft. On the day of the invasion, the Allied Tactical Air Forces massed more than 2,400 fighters and fighter bombers over the Channel and the beaches, a sky so full of Allied airplanes that the great fear was not the Luftwaffe, but collision and friendly fire. The workhorse of Quesada's command was the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now, this matters to a lot of you, so let me be precise. The Thunderbolt was a monster of an airplane, the heaviest single-seat fighter of the war, built around a big air-cooled radial engine, the Pratt & Whitney R-2800, putting out around 2,000 horsepower. It carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, 4 in each wing, and it could haul up to 2,500 pounds of bombs or a rack of 5-inch rockets down onto a target and still fight its way home. It could top out around 430 miles an hour and climb past 40,000 feet. In the summer of 1944, you would have seen both kinds on Quesada's forward strips. The older Razorback models, with the framed canopy and the high spine behind the cockpit, and the new bubble-top models just arriving, with the clear teardrop canopy that gave the pilot a view all the way around. Both flew together in those weeks, and every one of them wore the black and white invasion stripes painted onto wings and fuselage in the first days of June, and the white star on the blue circle with the blue outlined bars, the national insignia of that summer. Get those details right, and the old crews will trust you. Get them wrong, and they will know instantly that you did not do the work. The reason the Thunderbolt was the right airplane for this job, and here is a detail the fighter pilots among you will appreciate, is that big radial engine. A liquid-cooled engine, like the one in the Mustang, could be knocked out by a single rifle bullet through the coolant lines. The Thunderbolt's radial could take a terrible beating, lose whole cylinders, and keep running long enough to get the pilot home. When your mission is to fly low over the enemy's front line, into the teeth of every machine gun and light flak piece he owns, survivability is not a luxury. It is the whole game. So Quesada had the airplane. What he did next was invent the way to use it. The problem he set out to solve sounds simple and was fiendishly hard. A tank commander down in the hedgerows of Normandy runs into a German gun he cannot deal with. There's a Thunderbolt overhead, right now, that could kill that gun in 10 seconds. But the tanker has no way to talk to the pilot, and the pilot, flying at 300 miles an hour, cannot see the gun that is perfectly obvious to the man on the ground. The two of them, the tanker and the pilot, are fighting the same battle 1,000 feet apart and might as well be on different planets. Every request for air support had to crawl back through layers of headquarters, get approved, get relayed, and come back. And by the time anything happened, the moment was gone and the tank was already burning. Quesada's answer was so obvious in hindsight that it is genuinely strange no one had done it. He put an airplane radio into a tank, a real one, the same very high frequency set the pilots used. And he put a pilot inside that tank, a flyer who had given up his place in a squadron to ride in the lead armor and act as the voice on the radio, a man who could look at the battlefield through a tanker's eyes and describe it in a fighter pilot's language. When the column ran into trouble, the man in the tank could look up, key the radio, and talk directly to the flight of Thunderbolts circling above. Same language, same instant, no headquarters in between. Thomas Alexander Hughes, whose biography of Quesada, titled Overlord, is the finest thing ever written about the man, and the source I lean on most heavily here, records Quesada explaining the idea to Bradley in almost those exact terms. This way, he said, the direction from the ground will be in language the fighter boy in the air can understand. That is the whole revolution in one sentence. Not better airplanes, not more bombs. A shared language, spoken in real time, between the man on the ground and the man in the air. The first trials used just 2 Sherman tanks rigged up at his headquarters with the extra radio. By the last week of July, 1944, the system worked so well that the armored commanders were fighting over who got the coverage. And out of that came the thing he is most remembered for by the people who remember him at all. He called it armored column cover. Here's how it worked. A flight of 4 Thunderbolts would fly a continuous orbit directly above an advancing armored column, like an umbrella that moved with the tanks. Every 30 minutes or so, a fresh flight of 4 would arrive to relieve them, so the umbrella never closed. The flight leader up top talked constantly to the pilot down in the lead tank, and when the column hit resistance, the response was not measured in hours, and it was not measured in the passage of paperwork. It could be as little as 3 minutes from the tanker's call to bombs coming down on the target. Let me give you 2 moments, both drawn from the record, so you can feel what that meant. In one action, a German 88mm gun was sitting at a crossroads, picking off American tanks one by one as they came into view, and there was nothing the tankers could do about it. The call went up. 4 Thunderbolts rolled in and destroyed the gun. In another, an armored column came around a bend into 2 Tiger tanks, the most feared armor the Germans had, and before those Tigers could do their work, the Thunderbolts were on them and left both of them burning by the roadside. That is the difference between having air support and having the idea of air support. Minutes instead of hours. A shared voice instead of a paper chain. Now layer the radar back in, because Quesada never forgot North Africa. He took the new microwave early warning radar and the precision tracking radar, and he used them not to defend against raids, but to run the offensive battle. From a radar station, he could watch his own airplanes as blips on a screen and redirect them in flight, peeling a flight of Thunderbolts off one job and sending it to a more urgent one while they were already airborne. And when the weather closed in over Normandy, as it constantly did, and the fighter bombers could not see the ground at all, he developed a way to bomb blind. He fed the airplane's speed and altitude by radio to a ground crew running a bombing computer, and that crew told the pilot the exact instant to release, so that Thunderbolts could put bombs onto a target they could not even see through the cloud. His men, with the black humor of combat flyers, called it dropping them in the pickle barrel. By the middle of July, his pilots were reaching for new weapons too. On the 17th of July, 1944, they were firing rockets at German locomotives and dropping the first loads of napalm, that horror of jellied gasoline, onto enemy positions. The tactical air war was becoming, week by week, a more precise and more lethal instrument, and Quesada was the man sharpening it. There is one story from that summer that tells you everything about the kind of officer he was, and it is completely true. On the 4th of July, 1944, Pete Quesada took the Supreme Allied Commander, Dwight Eisenhower himself, up over the German lines in a Mustang. Not in a bomber, not in a safe two-seat trainer well behind the front. In a single seat, P-51 fighter that had been crudely modified to jam a second man in behind the pilot. Quesada flew the General 50 miles beyond the Allied front line with 3 more Mustangs flying escort, and for 45 minutes, Eisenhower looked down at his own war, at the artillery flashing below, at the ground he was about to order his armies to break out across. It was reckless beyond belief. If that airplane had gone down, the Allied cause loses its supreme commander to a stunt. Both men got a mild reprimand for it. Bradley later said the two of them came back looking like schoolboys caught raiding a watermelon patch. But think about what it says. The Supreme Commander trusted Pete Quesada enough to strap into a fighter behind him and fly over the enemy. That is the level of confidence this forgotten man commanded. And then came the moment that proves the whole argument of this video, though it proves it through tragedy. By late July, the American army was stuck. The Normandy hedgerow country, that maze of ancient earth banks and sunken lanes, was perfect defensive ground. And the Germans were bleeding the First Army white in it. Bradley conceived a plan to punch a hole, a concentrated blow on a narrow front, and he named it Operation Cobra. And the centerpiece of Cobra was not Quesada's precise, low-flying fighter bombers. It was the heavy bombers. The plan called for something like 1,500 heavy bombers, the big 4-engine B-17s and B-24s, to carpet a rectangle of German-held ground roughly 7,000 yards long and 2,500 yards deep, and simply obliterate everything in it. More than 3,000 tons of bombs in a single concentrated blow, with hundreds of fighters escorting. Here is the problem, and it is the problem at the heart of this entire channel. The heavy bomber was a strategic weapon, a blunt instrument designed to level a city or a factory complex from very high altitude. It was never designed to place bombs with precision a few hundred yards in front of friendly troops. And on the 25th of July, 1944, that mismatch turned lethal. Some of the bombers dropped short. Their bombs fell not on the Germans, but on the Americans waiting to attack. And among the men killed by his own country's bombs that day was Lieutenant General Leslie McNair, the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater in the entire war, killed by friendly bombs in a field in Normandy. The casualty figures for that day are disputed, and I am going to give them to you honestly, rather than pick the number that sounds best. The most commonly cited figures are around 111 Americans killed and something close to 490 wounded on the 25th of July. Some accounts put it lower, at around 102 killed and 380 wounded. Add in the aborted attempt the day before, when short bombs also killed American troops, and the total human cost of Cobra's bombing before the breakout even succeeded runs into many hundreds. The historians do not fully agree, and you should be suspicious of anyone who hands you one clean number, because the record itself is not clean. I want to be very careful and fair here, because this is exactly the kind of thing this audience will hold me to. Those short bombs were dropped by the heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force. They were not Quesada's airplanes, and they were not his doctrine. In fact, Cobra is the sharpest possible illustration of the argument he spent the whole war making. The strategic bombing establishment believed you could take its city, smashing heavy bombers, and simply point them at the battlefield, and they would do the job. Quesada believed the battlefield needed a different, finer instrument. The fighter bomber talked onto its target by a man who could see it. Cobra, in the worst way imaginable, proved him right. Eisenhower was so shaken that he is said to have sworn never again to use the heavy bombers in close support of troops. In my view, and I lean here on Omar Bradley's own account in his memoir, A Soldier's Story, Cobra is the clearest single piece of evidence in the entire European war for why close air support had to be its own discipline, with its own aircraft and its own methods, and not an afterthought bolted onto the strategic bombing campaign. Quesada had been building that discipline for months. Cobra was the price of not having listened to him sooner. And once the breakout finally came, once the hole was punched, it was Quesada's tactical air that turned a breach into a rout. As the American armor poured out into open country, the armored column cover went with it, that moving umbrella of Thunderbolts, and the German army in the west began to come apart. The clearest example came in early August, at a place called Mortain. Hitler ordered a massive armored counterattack, several panzer divisions driving west to cut the American breakout off at its base. It was exactly the kind of concentrated armored thrust that, back in 1940, had won Germany the whole of France in a matter of weeks, and this time it was stopped in large part from the air. On the 7th of August, 1944, Allied fighter bombers swarmed the German columns caught out on the roads. The British flew hundreds of rocket-firing Typhoon sorties, more than 300 that day alone, and the American tactical commands flew hundreds more. The German attack stalled and then died on those roads, hammered from a sky it could not answer, while the American infantry held the ground. A week or so later came the killing ground at Falaise, where two Allied armies closed like a pincer around a retreating German force, and the only way out was through a shrinking gap under a sky owned entirely by Allied airplanes. In one action on the 13th of August, a group of 37 Thunderbolts found a mass of 800 to 1,000 German vehicles jammed on the roads west of Argentan and claimed to have destroyed 400 to 500 of them in about an hour. Now, I have to stop and be honest about those numbers, because this is where a lot of documentaries lie to you. The tank and vehicle kill claims from tactical air in Normandy were, by the careful work of later historians, substantially inflated. Ian Gooderson, in his rigorous study, Air Power at the Battlefront, went back through the actual ground surveys, the teams that walked the battlefields afterward and counted the wrecks and examined how each one had died, and found that the number of German tanks actually destroyed directly by air attack was far lower than the pilots claimed. I think the honest verdict, and Gooderson's evidence supports it, is that the decisive effect of Quesada's air power was not in the raw count of tanks it burned. It was in what it did to the German army's ability to move at all, a tank that cannot travel by day, that must hide in a wood and creep forward only at night, that cannot be resupplied with fuel because every truck on the road is a target, is a tank that has been largely defeated, whether or not a rocket ever touches it. That is the real measure of what he built, not a tally of kills, a German army that could no longer maneuver. This was not free. Flying low all day into the enemy's ground fire is one of the most dangerous jobs in the whole war. In the roughly 2 weeks from the start of Cobra to the fighting at Mortain, Quesada's command lost around 80 aircraft, and the records show that the overwhelming majority of them, on the order of 3/4 or more, fell to ground fire, to flak and to small arms, and only a small fraction to enemy fighters. His pilots were not dying in glamorous dogfights. They were dying down in the dirt, in the place where the airplane meets the front line, which is exactly the place he had decided the airplane belonged. The campaign rolled on, across France, into the autumn, and then into the crisis of the winter. In December of 1944, the Germans launched their last great gamble in the West, the offensive we remember as the Battle of the Bulge, driving some 50 miles into the American line across a front of around 85 miles through the snow and fog of the Ardennes. And here is a detail that ought to be famous and is not. Quesada, along with another American air general, had warned the high command that the Germans were massing for something in the Ardennes. They were brushed aside. When the blow fell on the 16th of December, Quesada was at the 1st Army headquarters, right there with the ground command he had spent the whole war serving, and the moment the weather broke, his tactical air power came down on the German columns with everything it had. The radar-directed methods, the bad weather bombing, all of it, in the hardest flying conditions of the war. The same team, the same trust, the same instrument he had been building since Normandy, now saving the American army in its worst moment. Let me pull the hard numbers together in one place, because I know a lot of you keep score, and you should. 150 hours in the air on the question mark flight, more than 6 days aloft, 43 refuelings, 11,000 miles, 5 distinguished flying crosses, 21 combat missions flown personally in North Africa, 8 airplane crashes, survived across a lifetime of flying. 18 fighter groups in the 9th Air Force, around 1,500 aircraft, of which his command held roughly 11 groups. More than 2,400 Allied fighters over the beaches on the day of the invasion. 4 Thunderbolts in every armored column cover orbit, relieved every 30 minutes, striking within as little as 3 minutes of the call. 8 50 caliber guns, and up to 2,500 pounds of bombs on each of those Thunderbolts, driven by a 2,000 horsepower radial, 1,500 heavy bombers, and 3,000 tons over the Cobra carpet. 111 Americans killed there by their own bombs, give or take, the number still argued over. More than 300 Typhoon sorties in a single day at Mortain. 37 Thunderbolts, over 800 to 1,000 vehicles at Falaise. Around 80 of his own airplanes lost in 2 weeks, the great majority to ground fire. 50 miles of German penetration in the Bulge. These are not the numbers of a footnote. These are the numbers of a decisive campaign run by a man most people have never heard of. So how does that happen? How does a man do all of this and then vanish from the story? That is the real mystery, and the answer is where this stops being just a war story and starts being something you will recognize from your own life. The war ends. Quesada is one of the most respected combat air commanders in the world, a man ground generals actually asked for by name, and in the peace that follows, a great reorganization begins. In 1947, the Air Force finally becomes what it had wanted to be for 30 years, an independent service separate from the Army, equal to the Navy. And that new Air Force is built from its foundation around one idea above all others: strategic bombing, the atomic bomb, a long-range force that could fly over any enemy's army and destroy his homeland. That was the mission that had justified independence. That was the mission with the budget and the prestige and the future. Strategic Air Command became the crown jewel of the new service, and the bomber generals became its royalty. And close air support, the thing Quesada had spent the war perfecting, the thing that flew low and slow and worked hand in hand with the Army. In the new Air Force, that was the poor relation. Worse than poor. It was faintly embarrassing, a reminder of the days when the flyers had been mere servants of the ground commanders. The whole point of independence was to get away from being the Army's aerial artillery. And here was Quesada, the living embodiment of the airplane as the Army's partner, insisting that this despised mission was, in fact, one of the most important things air power did. He was given command of the new Tactical Air Command in 1946 and promoted to Lieutenant General in 1947. On paper, that looks like success. It was not, because the new Air Force did not really believe in his command's mission, and it showed where it always shows, in the budget and the aircraft. Effective at the end of 1948, Tactical Air Command was folded, along with the Air Defense Mission, into a larger Continental Command, and Quesada's headquarters was stripped down and reduced to something close to a paper organization, an operational headquarters with its airplanes and its people drawn away to other priorities. The service was telling him, as clearly as an institution ever tells anyone anything, that what he did not matter anymore. I want to be careful and fair, because the honest historians are, this was partly a genuine budget crisis. Money was desperately short in those years, and everything got cut. But money reveals priorities. When you have to choose, you protect what you believe in, and you starve what you do not. And the record, laid out in the official Army Air Force's history compiled by Wesley Frank Craven and James Lee Cate, and in the fine article Rebecca Grant wrote about Quesada for Air Force magazine, is that the leadership of the new Air Force chose to protect the strategic bombing force and starve the tactical one. In my view, the gutting of Tactical Air Command at the end of 1948 was not a neutral accounting decision. It was a statement of values. And the value it stated was that the mission Pete Quesada had bled for, the mission that had helped win the ground war in Europe, was expendable. He fought it in the way strong men fight a losing institutional battle, and he lost. He clashed with a chief of staff of the Air Force, Hoyt Vandenberg, a strategic bombing man through and through, and a man who was rising exactly as fast as Quesada was stalling. He asked for a reassignment and got shuffled into a dead-end committee job, and then out of even that. He ran the test task force for the first hydrogen bomb, which is a serious job, but it was not command of the mission he cared about. And in the autumn of 1951, Pete Quesada retired from the Air Force. He was 47 years old. 47. The man who had flown Eisenhower over the German lines, who had built the finest air-ground team of the war, walked out of the service in the prime of his life. And there were rumors, never fully confirmed and never fully denied, that he was resigning in protest at what the Air Force had done to tactical air power. And here is the bitterest part, the part that turns this from a sad story into an indictment. Within a few years, the country needed exactly what he had built and had thrown away. When war came again, in Korea in 1950, the new Air Force discovered to its horror that it had forgotten how to do close air support. It had trained for strategic bombing and air defense. Its brand new jet fighters were badly suited to the low and slow work of supporting infantry, and the service actually had to pull propeller-driven Mustangs, the F-51s, out of storage to do the job, the very same kind of airplane that had done it in the last war. The air-ground coordination that Quesada had perfected had to be painfully relearned under fire at the cost of soldiers' lives. In the first 75 days of that war, close air support consumed something like 2/3 of the entire sortie capacity of the Far East Air Forces. 2/3. The mission the Air Force had decided did not matter. Turned out to be the mission the ground troops needed most, exactly as Quesada had said, and the men who had to relearn it from scratch were paying for the institution's forgetting. Thomas Alexander Hughes put it plainly in his biography. Quesada's groundbreaking methods, he wrote, were all but forgotten after the war. All but forgotten. Not because they failed, they succeeded completely. They were forgotten because they had won the wrong argument inside a service that had decided to believe in something else. Now, before I give you my verdict, let me get down into the operational weeds one more time, because there is a detail here that the sharper viewers will want, and it is the thing that really separated Quesada from everyone else. Plenty of officers understood that airplanes could help the Army. What made Quesada different was that he refused to let the airman and the soldier stay strangers. He rotated his fighter pilots through the ground perspective on purpose. He put them in the tanks. He sent them to live with the armored units and see the war from the turret, so that when they climbed back into a Thunderbolt, they knew, in their bones, what the man on the ground could see and could not see, what he feared, what he needed. He built a shared understanding into the human beings, not just into the radios. Anyone can order 2 units to cooperate. Quesada made them into one thing, and that is a management insight as much as a military one, which brings me to something I suspect a lot of you have already been thinking. If this pattern sounds familiar, if you have ever watched the person who actually understands the work, the one who solved the real problem, get pushed aside while the person who managed upward and looked right in the meeting got the promotion in the corner office, then you are not imagining it. The pattern is older than any of us. It just usually does not get this many people killed. Quesada solved the actual problem. Vandenberg and the bomber establishment won the actual argument. Those are not the same skill, and the institution rewarded the second one. I think most of you have seen a smaller version of that play out in your own working lives, and I think that is exactly why the story lands the way it does. So here is my verdict, and I will give you both halves of it, because this channel does not do hero worship, and it does not do hit jobs. Pete Quesada was not a saint and not a martyr. He was hot-tempered and difficult, and he made enemies, and some of the men who outmaneuvered him were not fools or villains. They were serious officers who genuinely believed the atomic age had made the strategic bomber the decisive weapon, and who were not entirely wrong about the world they were preparing for. The nuclear standoff that defined the next 40 years was real, and someone had to build the force that deterred it. I'm not going to pretend that was worthless, but I believe, and the weight of the evidence in Hughes and in Craven and Kate supports this, that the Air Force made a serious and costly error when it treated close air support as beneath it, and that, in erasing Quesada, it erased the hard-won knowledge of how to keep faith with the soldier on the ground. The proof is that we have had to relearn his lessons at a price paid in blood in almost every war since. Korea relearned them. Vietnam relearned them. And the modern fights over whether to keep a dedicated ground attack aircraft in the inventory at all are, at bottom, the same argument Quesada was having in 1948, between the people who fly high and think big and the people who remember that somewhere down in the dirt there's a soldier who needs an airplane over his head in the next 3 minutes. David Spires, in his study of the tactical air command that supported Patton's army, called that air-ground partnership one of the great and underappreciated achievements of American arms in the war. I agree with him completely. And the man who did the most to build the American version of it retired at 47, went off to run the Federal Aviation Agency and to briefly own the Washington Senators baseball team, and slipped out of the history books while the men he had proven wrong wrote themselves in. That is the erasure, not a conspiracy, something quieter and more permanent than a conspiracy. An institution simply deciding over time in 1,000 small choices about budgets and promotions and which stories got told, that the man who had been right about the wrong thing was not worth remembering. And so the country forgot the general who taught its airplanes to fight alongside its soldiers, and it had to pay tuition again and again to learn the lesson a second and a third and a fourth time. His name is Pete Quesada, and you will not forget it now, because you know what he did and what it cost, and why the silence around him is not an accident. The next time someone lists the great American air commanders of the Second World War and stops at the bomber barons, you will know there's a name missing from the list. The name of the man who stayed low. A lot of you have deep personal ties to this one. If your father or your grandfather flew the Thunderbolt with the 9th Air Force, or rode in the armor of the First Army under that umbrella of fighters, or worked the flight line on those muddy forward strips in France, I would genuinely like to hear about it. Those stories are the real record, and they matter more than anything I can say. Drop them in the comments and read the ones other people leave, because some of the best history on this channel is down there, in your memories, not up here in mine. That's the story. The sources are in the description. I'll see you in the next one.